Thank you very much, Ambassador Segura, and thank you to Felix and you and Dessa for the kind of invitation to speak at today's workshop. In thinking about the Sendai Framework midterm review, I'd like to first go back to the periods of 2014-2015, when both the Sustainable Development Goals and the Sendai Framework were being negotiated. That period felt to me like a period of hope and enthusiasm. The multilateral system seemed to be working. The global community appeared fully aware that there was a need for real transformation. And there was a sense of focus encapsulated in this phrase, leave no one behind, reflecting that if we were going to solve the world's sustainability and development challenges, we should really start with addressing the issues of poverty and vulnerability. That sense of focus was reflected in the Sendai Framework in what I felt was a clear and perhaps relatively simple narrative embedded throughout the language of the Sendai Framework, and subsequently also in the Sendai Framework core indicator set. The narrative becomes apparent almost immediately in the expected outcome statement, where in a departure from the Hyogo framework of action, which is the predecessor to the Sendai Framework and which largely focused on saving people's lives and protecting their physical infrastructure, the Sendai Framework expected outcome statement clarified that effective disaster risk reduction requires a strategic shift from disaster management, or how to deal more effectively with the effects of disasters, to disaster risk management, or how to be more effective in preventing the effects of disasters from occurring in the first place. And secondly, it recognized comes from the protection of not just people's lives, but also their, in particular, their livelihoods and their health. Subsequently, in the Sendai Framework's guiding principles, the UN member states further stressed the focus on the protection of livelihoods in particular, and clarified that this means, first of all, a focus on the protection of people's productive assets, and secondly, that there's a need to provide special attention to people disproportionately affected by disasters, especially the poorest. And then finally, this narrative and sense of focus is concluded in the priorities for action section of the Sendai Framework, where member states defined these key productive assets, in particular those for people most in need of protection to secure the livelihoods of the poorest, as being livestock, working animals, tools, and seeds, recognizing that agriculture is the most vulnerable sector to the effects of disasters. This sense of focus on the need to protect people's livelihoods was eventually also reflected in 2016 in the core set of Sendai Framework indicators, through the inclusion for the very first time of an indicator, B5, that specifically measures the impact of disasters on people's livelihoods, very largely based on measuring the loss in terms of crops and the loss of people's livestock. One could argue that this clear narrative and sense of focus that comes through the Sendai Framework is also present in Sustainable Development Goal number 2, where targets 2.1 and 2.3 encourage the focus on the poor and vulnerable and stimulating the livelihoods of small-scale producers, while target 2.4 recognized the particular vulnerability of the agricultural sector to the effects of disasters. Now, while much has been achieved over the past 7 to 8 years, since the adoption of Sendai, and progress has been made, particularly in the areas of early warning systems, strengthening disaster loss and risk data, and transboundary cooperation, it is clear that a greater effort is needed to achieve the Sendai Framework goals. The 2022 Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction Co-Chair Summary clarifies that there is a clear need for accelerated implementation across the Sendai Framework's priorities to stop the spiral of increasing disaster impact and risk. Government policies remain largely reactive, and the vast majority of public spending is still allocated to recovery efforts and infrastructure, and not in support of affected people and their key productive assets. Agriculture remains the most vulnerable sector to disasters and absorbs most disaster losses. In this light, it is my hope that the Sendai Framework midterm review later this year, and subsequently the food system stocktake moment, will revisit and re-emphasize this perhaps simple narrative and sense of focus that was identified already back in 2015. namely that in order to truly protect the lives of the poorest and those most vulnerable to disasters, it is crucial to focus on enhancing the resilience of people's livelihoods. To do this, we need greater attention and investment in the protection of key productive assets that the poor and vulnerable rely on for their livelihoods. Again, in particular, livestock, working animals, tools, and seeds, as identified in the Sendai framework. The UN Food Systems Summit equally reflected this Sendai narrative through the inclusion of the importance of advancing equitable livelihoods and building resilience to vulnerability, shocks, and stresses in 2 of its 5 action areas. With natural disasters already and continuing to be the single greatest cause of agriculture losses across the globe, it will be critical for the upcoming stocktake event, which is intended to be solutions-oriented, to highlight the need for greater attention and investment in the protection of agriculture productive assets and to equip member states with the practical tools to do so. While true resilience will require action across all fronts, following the pathway of protecting livelihoods through a focus on key productive assets of the poor, including livestock, working animals, tools, and seeds, is perhaps the most efficient route to addressing vulnerability, enhancing resilience, addressing food insecurity, and eventually contributing to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Agenda. Thank you very much.